Portugal. For nearly 50 years, it was a right-wing dictatorship, ruled by António de Oliveira Salazar. He called his regime Estado Novo, the new state.
Salazar was the father of the nation.
The dictator demanded obedience and respect from his people. His major goal was to preserve his country's colonial empire at any cost.
In my village, lots of people were killed. My father was 38 when he died. My family were all shot.
Thousands were arrested and tortured.
Fear was widespread. The nation bowed to Salazar. He was like God.
Salazar's new state became the longest right-wing dictatorship in history. But how did the despot manage to stay in power for so long? Lisbon, August 27, 1963. António de Oliveira Salazar is cheered by thousands. He has already been in power for more than 30 years, but he still knows how to inspire the masses.
Só sentimento é ao mesmo tempo bastante alto e profundo para inundarmos a alma neste momento, o da firme determinação de defender a integridade nacional.
For 2 years, the despot had been waging a merciless war against rebels in Portugal's African colonies. The conflict was steadily spreading. The cost of the war was driving Portugal further and further into poverty. Salazar called on his people to persevere. Portugal, he said, was one of the world's last colonial powers and would remain so. Salazar alone had control of the country's finances. He alone determined Portuguese foreign policy and how it dealt with its colonies. Salazar ruled over an empire that spanned the globe. The Palacete de São Bento had been the residence of António de Oliveira Salazar ever since 1936. His close private sphere consisted of his domestic staff, who reverently addressed him as Dr. Salazar. His last housemaid, Rosalia Araujo, grew up in modest circumstances with 9 siblings. Like many Portuguese in the 1960s, she had to fend for herself at an early age. Rosalia was only 14 when she found employment in the dictator's household.
My starting wage was 100 escudos a month. By the end, I was only earning 300.
Back then, 300 escudos were equal to €1.50. To make ends meet in the dictator's household, the staff reared poultry in the garden.
He didn't waste any electricity on heating in winter. He worked with a blanket round his legs to keep himself warm.
The dictator lived a withdrawn life. He used to attend early mass at 6:30 and always dined alone. Salazar lived exactly the way he governed his country. He eschewed all forms of investment and abhorred debts.
Salazar was well known for his extreme parsimony and the austere and regular life he led. This put him in complete contrast to other European dictators of the time, who were regarded as wasteful megalomaniacs. His lifestyle was part of Salazar's charisma.
He was seen as a selfless idealist who set aside every personal need in the service of his country. The contacts he cultivated were virtually all of a professional nature. Throughout his life, he remained a bachelor.
In a certain way, he was embittered. He had never married and had hardly ever had a relationship with a woman. But we do know that, especially in his younger years, he had made the acquaintance of several women who were better placed socially. But in each case, the family was not happy about the relationship. This social rejection shaped him.
As a young man, he was rejected. Later, as a dictator, he demanded absolute respect.
Salazar clearly had a social hang-up. He became a university professor, which was clearly a social advancement, but the memory of his modest origins never left him.
The little village of Vimiero, 200 kilometers north of Lisbon. António de Oliveira Salazar was born in this house on April 28, 1889, the son of a farmhand. He and his 4 sisters grew up in humble circumstances. Social advancement was only possible through the Catholic Church. Salazar was intelligent and received support. He attended the seminary in Viseu. Catholicism, discipline, and self-restraint became part of his personality. He took an interest in the political circumstances in his country even at an early age. And he experienced instability and unrest.
His youth was strongly influenced by the final years of the monarchy, which was toppled in 1910. It was followed by the First Republic, a regime with an aggressive secularization policy directed against the church. Salazar rejected it entirely.
In 1910, he went to Coimbra to study law at Portugal's oldest university. Gifted and ambitious, he became a professor while still a young man. His special field was economics and finance. At the time, the political situation was becoming more and more precarious. Portugal experienced 20 coups in only 16 years. Since the end of the monarchy in 1910, there had been 44 changes of government, and the state was getting deeper and deeper into debt. On May 28, 1926, a military coup brought an end to the First Republic. Portugal was now a military dictatorship. At the age of 39, Professor António de Oliveira Salazar was appointed to the cabinet as a financial expert. His task was to prevent state bankruptcy and the imminent loss of the colonies.
There were 2 possibilities: to go further into debt or to pursue a strict austerity policy with the brunt of the measures being borne by the people. Salazar chose the latter course.
He reduced food imports and increased food exports. As a result, food became scarce and expensive. At the same time, Salazar raised taxes and imposed a pay freeze. Ordinary people had to go hungry. Salazar put construction measures on hold and saved wherever he could. As a result, in his first year in office, he achieved a budget surplus and began to reduce his country's foreign debts. He thus managed to avoid the imminent sellout of Portugal's colonies. This earned him widespread esteem. Salazar now enjoyed the unconditional support of the country's military leaders. Endowed with special powers, he established a veritable financial dictatorship.
He placed his faith in a very austere policy and controlled the entire national budget, even the money spent by the ministries.
On July 5, 1932, Salazar was appointed head of government. After reorganizing the state and preserving Portugal's colonial empire, this financial expert was regarded as the savior of the nation.
My grandmother worshipped Salazar. Why? Because the end of the First Republic was a time of great unrest, and people had had enough. Promises were never kept. All anyone wanted was calm and peace.
The Cardinal of Lisbon, Manuel Conchal Cerqueira, had been Salazar's best friend ever since they were students. so the new head of government could rely on the unconditional support of the most powerful man in the Catholic Church in Portugal. His Catholic faith was one of the pillars of Salazar's policies, which explains his aversion to communism. As he saw it, no one had the right to participate in political decision-making, not even the clergy. A new constitution confirmed the division of church and state. In parliament, only one party was allowed, the União Nacional. Its chairman was Salazar himself. In the Estado Novo, all decisions were taken by him alone.
Não discutimos Deus e a virtude. Não discutimos a pátria e a sua história. Não discutimos a autoridade e o seu prestígio. Não discutimos a família e a sua moral. Não discutimos a glória do trabalho e o seu dever.
Salazar was now the absolute ruler, not only over Portugal, but also over a global colonial empire. With a colonial history stretching back 500 years, Portugal was one of the oldest colonial powers in Europe. It had always been a proud seafaring nation.
The colonies played an important role in collective Portuguese identity. And when Salazar assumed power in the 1930s, this shaped his entire way of thinking. His every policy had a colonial element to it. This had been a tradition long before his arrival.
At the place where conquering Portuguese seafarers once set out, in 1940, Salazar had a monument to Henry the Navigator erected. On Empire Square in Lisbon, it honors the era of the first colonizers. When Salazar came to power, Portugal still had colonies all over the globe. Angola with its wealth of raw materials, Mozambique, Portuguese Guinea, and other parts of Africa. A maritime and commercial power, it also had several possessions in Portuguese India, as well as the free port of Macau on the south coast of China and East Timor.
Back then, Portugal was a poor, backward country. It lacked the money to develop its colonies economically, especially Angola and Mozambique.
In the 1930s, Portugal could no longer build any major production facilities in its possessions. But the colonies were a market for Portuguese products. Salazar held on firmly to the colonies. After all, they meant prestige and economic potential for the future. He was driven by a fear of losing them.
His foreign policy was geared to defending this empire, without compromise.
The colonies stood for a world power, which Portugal had long since ceased to be.
Salazar's image of Portugal was of a country that was intercontinental, that spread from the river Minho to Timor.
Propaganda posters in 1934 compared the area of Portugal's colonies with that of Europe. The message, Portugal is no small country. Pride was again to become the predominant feeling in Portugal, along with strident nationalism, just as they were propagated by other dictatorships in Europe. In Italy, fascist leader Benito Mussolini had ruled since 1924. In Germany, Adolf Hitler seized power in 1933. And in Spain, 3 years later, General Francisco Franco staged a coup and became head of state. Salazar modeled his country along their lines, but their personality cult was alien to him.
Salazar hardly ever turned to the people. And if he did, it was through speeches in parliament or addresses on the radio. As time passed, his appearances at major rallies became fewer and fewer.
The Portuguese Festival of Youth in 1940. This is how the Estado Novo, the new state, celebrated. Salazar didn't like to be center stage himself. Nevertheless, Like other dictators of the time, he had mass processions organized. And there were other fascist elements his dictatorship incorporated. Salazar adopted the Roman salute used by Mussolini. The Hitler Youth served as the model for the Mocidade Portuguesa, Portuguese youth, scout camp romanticism combined with religious instruction and political propaganda. From 1939 on, children were brought up in the spirit of the new state. The focus was on obedience, loyalty, and pride in the fatherland. Salazar's goal was an isolated and independent Portugal. His motto was orgullosamente sos, alone and proud of it. In the late 30s, Hitler's power in Germany grew. This forced Salazar to adopt a position. He rejected the Nazis' race laws and their anti-Semitism. As early as 1937, he ordered his ambassador in Berlin to do everything in his power to protect Portuguese Jews in Germany.
There was hardly any anti-Semitism in Portugal, and nothing that the regime could use for political purposes.
On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The start of the Second World War was a testing time for Salazar. With more and more countries in Europe sinking into chaos, the Portuguese dictator did everything he could to avoid becoming involved in the war.
Where foreign policy was concerned, Salazar was completely non-ideological. One of his intelligent visions was to preserve Portuguese neutrality.
Salazar wanted Portugal to remain at peace. It was the only way to guarantee the retention of all its overseas territories. The dictator showed himself to be a skilled tactician. For him, entering the war on the side of Germany was out of the question, because that would mean war with Great Britain. Ever since 1373, Britain and Portugal had been linked through the world's oldest diplomatic alliance, and Salazar didn't want that to change. At the same time, however, he announced that Portugal would not join Britain in its war with Germany. Right at the start of World War II, Salazar signed a neutrality accord with neighboring Spain. If General Franco did not enter the war on Hitler's side, Portugal too would remain uninvolved. Even though Salazar rejected Hitler's wars, it didn't stop him doing business with Nazi Germany. Not only was he a pragmatist, the Portuguese dictator was also an opportunist.
The Nazis bought products that were of military importance, not just sardines and wool, but also vital raw materials like tungsten, which, among other things, was used in tank production.
Portugal became Germany's second biggest supplier of tungsten after China. The Nazis needed vast quantities of the metal, which was also used to make armor-piercing ammunition. The tungsten trade brought in more than 120 tons of stolen gold, which was stored in the Portuguese National Bank. This income from abroad merely enhanced Salazar's reputation as a brilliant financial expert.
Many of the products which were bought from Nazi Germany were paid for with gold that was stamped with a swastika. And this gold filled Portugal's coffers.
More and more Jews from all over Europe were fleeing to neutral Portugal. From Lisbon, they planned to emigrate to the United States or South America. In this way, around 100,000 Jews avoided the concentration camps. But as their numbers grew, Salazar became increasingly concerned. Fearing Hitler's wrath, in 1940, Salazar instructed his diplomats to stop issuing visas to Jews. In 1942, Salazar embarked on one of his rare trips abroad and met Franco in Seville. Hitler was putting Spain under increasing pressure to enter the war on Germany's side, but Salazar implored the Spanish dictator to remain neutral, and his efforts were rewarded. Franco promised not to become involved in the conflict. Salazar still believed that Hitler's armies could win the war, so to cover his back, he maintained good relations with Nazi Germany. But in 1943, when the tide was turning for Hitler, the Portuguese dictator turned to the Allies. He allowed Britain and America to establish bases in the Azores, which the Allies could then use against the Axis powers. Lisbon, May 25, 1945. The dictator is celebrated as a victor without ever having fought. Calls for democracy, which were also being heard in other countries of Europe, were to be silenced through personal appearances by Salazar. Many Portuguese saw the dictator as a peacemaker. They believed he had saved the country once again. But now the Cold War was looming. Through its victory in the Second World War, the Soviet Union had become a world power and was locking horns with the West for global supremacy.
Anti-communism was an integral element of Salazar's policies. Consequently, the Soviet Union was his country's principal foe.
In autumn 1945, Salazar established the Policía Internacional e de Defensa Estado, PIDE for short. It was a new secret police force designed to nip any opposition in the bud and persecute Portugal's communists. Now, high-ranking American diplomats were welcome guests in Portugal. Salazar also took a clear stance with regard to foreign policy. He intended to remain on the side of the West, in opposition to the communist Eastern Bloc. When NATO was established on April 4, 1949, Portugal was one of its founding members. The Western Alliance thus accepted Salazar's right-wing dictatorship as an equal partner in the fight against communism.
In the Cold War against the Soviet Union, it was of vital importance to the West to have strategic partners in the southwest of Europe, in Spain and Portugal. To anti-communist and therefore anti-Soviet regimes.
In his persecution of oppositionists and communists, Salazar was able to rely on help from abroad.
The secret services of Western countries like France and Germany gathered information on Portuguese citizens in exile and passed it on to the PIDE. But there was also collaboration with the CIA.
Peniche, a fishing village on the Atlantic coast 100 kilometers north of Lisbon. This old fortress used to be one of the most notorious prisons run by the PIDE. In the 1950s, the regime had the cell tract extended. Anyone who was against Salazar was arrested. Many were tortured and in some cases killed. During the dictatorship, at least 2,500 Portuguese were imprisoned in the fortress at Peniche. One of them was José Pedro Soares. Soares was arrested in the summer of 1971 at the age of 21. He was a communist who organized strikes and protests. That made him an enemy of the state. Before being incarcerated in Peniche, he was interrogated at PIDE headquarters in Lisbon. He was tortured for several days.
I never opened my mouth. I didn't say a word. Oh, so you're not going to talk? They wouldn't let me sleep. They poured water on my face and beat me a lot. Then one of them took out a whip. Now you'll see, he said. He whirled it in front of me, just like an animal trainer in the circus. I was covered in blood. My shirt was in shreds. I fell to the ground. There was blood everywhere. It stuck to my body for days. I still have the scars on my legs.
The Torre do Tombo, the National Archives in Lisbon. Stored here are thousands of interrogation reports and files on political prisoners. Many others were destroyed by PIDE agents. This makes the era of repression harder to work through. Nevertheless, historians like Duncan Simpson are trying to determine just how much power the secret police had.
The political police enjoyed very large arbitrary powers, the power to arrest for 6 months without any charges being made. The use of torture was very frequent, and more psychological forms of torture, which were mainly isolation, which was a technique developed by the PIDE mostly after its contacts with the CIA.
Towards the end of the regime, the PIDE had about 2,500 members, 1,800 of whom were agents. Considering that Portugal had a population of around 8.5 million, that's a comparatively small security apparatus. Documents show that some of the people accepted the secret police. They saw its agents as persons commanding respect who had good links with the government. Indeed, many citizens actively sought contact with the secret police because they thought they could benefit from it.
The PIDE was seen as a powerful force within the regime, which in a sense could help to overcome certain obstacles for the common citizen. They approached this PIDE agents, and he indeed spoke to his hierarchy, and through him, the message from below eventually reached Salazar himself.
The PIDE was particularly active in the towns and cities. Controls were hardly necessary in the countryside where, in the mid-20th century, rigid hierarchies still prevailed. Life was still determined by Catholicism, obedience, and a respect for authorities. It was a mentality the regime could rely on.
There was this famous saying by Salazar: the state must be so powerful that it has no need to use force.
Ignorance was a fundamental pillar of the regime. Compulsory education was just 4 years for boys and only 3 for girls. The dictator purposely invested little in education. There was no way out of poverty.
Few of the children at my school wore shoes. Even in those days, that was unheard of in Europe. After the Civil War, people in Spain were poor, but not as poor as we were. Most of us went to school barefoot all year round, in summer and in winter.
Portugal was largely cut off from the outside world, a country without any progress. In 1960, the year of Africa, 18 colonies on the continent gained independence. Only Portugal clung on to its overseas territories. Then, a year later, fighting erupted in Angola. Rebels attacked Portuguese farms in the north of the country. More than 1,000 settlers and numerous Angolan farmhands were killed. It was the start of a colonial war. A few weeks later, Salazar appointed himself defense minister and called for resolute resistance, fully in the style of a colonial master.
O que seria de Angola na atual crise se Angola não fosse Portugal?
The dictator sent troops. He planned swift and rigorous intervention. but the military was poorly equipped and ill-prepared for a war. Angola was only the beginning. In December 1961, Indian troops marched into Portuguese India and annexed the territory. The Portuguese were militarily inferior and had to surrender their Indian possessions without a fight. In 1963, a guerrilla war broke out in Portuguese Guinea in West Africa. A year later, there was a rebellion in Mozambique in the southeast of the continent. Salazar was now fighting a war on 3 fronts, thousands of kilometers from Portugal. The behavior of Salazar's army radicalized more and more people in the colonies. His troops were guilty of serious violations of human rights and attacks on the civilian population. Jacinto Francisco was still a child when his father attracted the attention of the PIDE.
My father gathered all the young people in the village together and said, "Watch out, be prepared. Some die in war, the others survive, and the survivors have to carry on the war." Then agents banged on our door. They'd come for my father. He was handcuffed and arrested. They wanted to finish off everyone in our village. Lots of people were killed. My father was only 38 when he died. All my family was shot. I witnessed everything. That's why later I joined the rebels. It was a terrible time for me.
Those who fought with the independence movements called themselves freedom fighters. In Salazar's eyes, though, they were terrorists. Conscription was increased to 4 years. Now, nearly every young Portuguese had to go to war. Hundreds of thousands were sent from Lisbon to the colonies. In 1966, the troop ship Nissa set off for Mozambique. One of those on board was 21-year-old António Ferreira.
I knew that things weren't going too well overseas, but what could I do? We were all crammed together on board and kept hearing rallying cries like, "We're going overseas to defend our homeland." We had to go because those territories belonged to Portugal.
António Ferreira was supposed to defend Portuguese territory more than 5,000 kilometers from his homeland. Like many other soldiers, he soon lost his belief in the war being justified, partly because the troops got to know the local people.
We realized that we were wasting our time and that we and the local people were being sacrificed. It was their country, and we were the invaders.
The Portuguese faced adversaries who were totally resolute. And it was the same in every colony where there was rebellion. The war overseas became more and more futile, but Salazar stuck to his rigid colonial policy. Morale amongst the troops sank, and support dwindled even in the motherland.
From 1966 to 67 at the latest, criticism of the war grew. One of the clearest signs was immigration. People, it said, vote with their feet, and many left the country. It was their way of showing that they rejected the regime.
Between 1961 and 1974, around 1.5 million Portuguese emigrated. They were fleeing not only from military service, but also from poverty, because the huge cost of the war was ruining Portugal. In the late 60s, prices rose by up to 8% a year. Whereas other European countries were enjoying growing prosperity, over half the homes in Portugal had no running water. 7 million Portuguese, almost the entire population, were just about living on the breadline. In Lisbon, the slums were spreading. As in previous years, Salazar spent the summer of 1968 at a fortress near Cascais. The dictator was 79 years old. In August, he suffered a serious stroke. Salazar remained in need of care and was no longer able to govern. In hospital, he was visited by European politicians like West German Chancellor Kurt Georg Kiesinger. He paid his respects not only to Salazar, but also to his successor, Maceo Caetano, who in September 1968 was already appointed Portugal's new leader. Caetano pursued the old dictator's policies with the same relentlessness. Salazar was oblivious to the fact that he no longer ruled the country.
Right up to his death, we kept it from Dr. Salazar that he was no longer head of the government, that he was no longer in charge. No one told him, not even the new leadership. And who were we to tell him? His domestic staff? He died without knowing it.
On July 27, 1970, the dictator passed away. Closest to the coffin and at his side to the very end was Rosalia Araújo. António de Oliveira Salazar had ruled the country for 40 years. His death also meant the end of the Estado Novo. The regime itself continued to exist, with Maceo Caetano at its head. But the new leader lacked the charisma of his predecessor. The majority of Portuguese had grown up with Salazar and his reputation as a selfless servant of his people. The most powerful man in Portugal was laid to rest in a simple grave in the cemetery in his home village. His epitaph reads, "He came from modest circumstances, he lived modestly, and he died modestly." The world empire the patriarch left behind had degenerated into the poorhouse of Europe. Nowhere else were incomes so low or illiteracy so high. 1 in 4 Portuguese could neither read nor write. Poverty was steadily increasing. Salazar's successor, Maceo Caetano, reacted to resistance with even more repression. The colonial wars too were pursued with unrelenting severity. Even in 1974, 14,000 Portuguese troops were still involved in futile and costly conflicts in the colonies.
Over more than 10 years, hundreds of thousands of Portuguese were mobilized for the war in 3 regions of Africa. That placed massive demands on the troops. They had to cope with the risk of being killed or crippled. And there was also post-traumatic stress. The war took its toll. As a result, large sections of the populace turned their backs on the regime.
The moment came when the troops had had enough. They laid down their arms and said, "Not a single soldier more for the colonies."
In the early morning of April 25, 1974, the radio station in Lisbon played the song Grandola Vita Morena. It was the signal for rebellion.
I was awoken by my mother at 3 in the morning. She was a seamstress and worked until late into the night. "Get up," she said. "I think there's a revolution taking place."
Tanks appeared on the streets of Lisbon. The plotters occupied the strategic points in the capital, a few ministries and the state broadcasting center. But the soldiers came as liberators, and the people were elated. As a sign of solidarity, many stuck flowers into the barrels of the soldiers' rifles. It was a gesture which earned the rebellion the name Carnation Revolution.
The old regime wasn't toppled on that day, it simply collapsed. Its main supporters had been the armed forces and the police. and the whole structure just fell apart.
That day, Alfredo Cunha took photos at the end of the dictatorship.
April the 25th, 1974, was the most important day of my life, the day we'd all been hoping for.
He also met Fernando José Maya, the captain who became the face of the Carnation Revolution. Maya was in charge of events in the city centre and urged everyone to remain peaceful. Anyone in the military who failed to cooperate was arrested. This also applied to agents of the PIDE. Maceo Quetano was removed from office. After 48 years, the dictatorship had been ended peacefully in just one day. Most Portuguese experienced the demise of the regime as a huge celebration. Political prisoners were released. Among them was José Pedro Soares.
I remember that in the days that followed, everyone in my village came to my house to see me. We were celebrated as heroes.
For the people, the song that signaled the start of the revolution became the song of freedom.
The year which followed the 25th of April was like a party. We were all so happy.
The end of the dictatorship heralded a period of radical social change. The Portuguese people now demanded political rights and freedom for people in the colonies. Over the next 18 months, Portugal's African colonies were granted independence, putting an irrevocable end to 500 years of colonial history as a world power. In 1976, the first free elections in over half a century took place. They were won by the Socialist Party, a moderate left-wing grouping which was oriented politically and socially towards the West. In 1986, Portugal became a member of the European Union. Today, there is one thing in particular which serves as a reminder of the end of nearly 50 years of dictatorship. The anniversary of the Carnation Revolution is a national holiday, and its main figures enjoy heroic status. However, because the act of liberation is glorified, memories of the decades of oppression threaten to fade.
Even today, as a society, we still suffer from the Salazar dictatorship. We are still far too uncritical. We do not take our responsibility for our society seriously enough. Too few people exercise their right to vote. We do not participate enough.
Half a century has now passed since the dictatorship was brought to an end. But the Salazar era still hasn't been completely worked through.
Above all, there is one taboo that needs to be broached. We have not dealt with the colonial war.
Today, though, the right-wing extremism of the former dictator is met with widespread rejection. António de Oliveira Salazar's grave has not become a place of pilgrimage. The house where he was born is dilapidated. No one visits it, and no one tries to maintain it. The building stands as a symbol of the political attitude towards the man who was once the father of the nation.
There is no nostalgia where Salazar is concerned. No political party lays claim to his legacy or wishes to revive his policies.
Portugal has largely been spared the widespread shift to the right which other parts of Europe have experienced. In the Portugal of today, political freedom is just as natural as the democratic system. Consequently, Europe's longest right-wing dictatorship is sinking further into oblivion.